Hey, good morning, everybody, and afternoon to folks on the West Coast. See that we've got some folks still popping on, so I think we'll give it like just another minute or two, and then we'll get started here. Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you guys happen to be located. Welcome to NCAI webinar, where we'll be discussing tribal consultation and specifically the recent GAO report on tribal consultation and permitting. We'll go through a few housekeeping items to begin with, and then we'll jump right in. So just to start off and review for everybody, this is sort of a screenshot of a generic desktop of what you should more or less be seeing as you're listening to the webinar. As you can see in the center of your screen here, hopefully you'll have the GoToWebinar viewer where you'll be able to view the slides that we have up, and then you'll also have a toolbar where you can control your actions and the way in which you listen, or if you want to raise your hand during the webinar. This is an expanded view of that toolbar for you. If you look up here at this orange arrow, this is where you can expand and contract the toolbar. If you want to minimize it on your window, you click here. On these drop-down menus, this is where you control your audio. And at this point, I would remind folks to make sure that they're dialed in correctly, to dial in the correct number, the access code, as well as the PIN code. And this is important because this will allow you to actually communicate and ask questions and raise your once you've raised your hand at the end if you do have a question. And to that end, if you need to raise your hand and ask a question at the end of the presentation or during to indicate you want to ask a question at the end, that's this button right here. I'll be able to see that you've raised your hand, and then at the end I can take you off mute. But in order to be able to do that, like I said, you need to enter your PIN code. So that's pretty important. If you don't want to ask a question out loud to the group, excuse me, you can expand the questions tab right here, and then you can actually type a question, and we'll try to get to that and have that question answered for you. We will do Q&A at the end of the presentation, and then what we'll do is we will actually post the recorded webinar to our YouTube page. The link you see on your screen is to NCAI's YouTube page. In a follow-up email, we'll include a PDF of the slides for you, as well as, pardon me. We got a little, what's going on here? Pardon me. As well as there we go. As well as a link to a direct link to the webinar. So I think with that, what I'd like to do is just introduce everybody to our presenters. My name is Darren Modulewski. I'm Policy Counsel here at NCAI. Part of my portfolio is environment, natural resources, energy development, and cultural heritage issues. And I'll be moderating and sort of controlling the panel today. And then presenting today, we have Mr. Derek Bitso, who is Diné and a citizen of the Navajo Nation, General Counsel to the National Congress of American Indians, and he oversees the land and natural resources work here at NCAI. He's also a graduate of Arizona State University College of Law. And then we're also joined here at the Embassy of Tribal Nations by Mr. Jody Cummings, who's a partner at Steptoe and Johnson and an enrolled member of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina. And his practice areas cover a range of federal Indian law issues, including natural resource development and environmental issues as they relate to tribal lands. And he's also a former deputy solicitor for Indian Affairs at the Department of Interior during the Obama administration. So we're very lucky to have them on hand today for this webinar. And I think with that, we'll get started. We'll turn it over to Mr. Cummings.
So, hi everyone, great to be on with you today. I think we're actually going to start the discussion with Derek, who will lead off by talking a little bit about Executive Order 13175, about tribal consultation, and then we'll talk about the report itself from GAO that came out in the spring. There's some, I guess, potential next steps that tribal governments might consider in response to the report, and maybe we'll have some Q&A on the end of that if folks want to comment or ask questions about what we've talked about today. So let me just go ahead and first turn it over to Derek. Derek, if you want to get started with the discussion about EO 13175.
Sure. Thank you, Jody, and thank you, Darren, for that wonderful introduction. We thought it would be helpful in context, to provide context to this conversation, to talk a little bit about Executive Order 13175, which is underlying all of the GAO report and everything that we're about to discuss today. It's worth noting that Executive Order 13175 was initially instituted by the Clinton administration in 2000. It followed a summit where the Clinton administration had reached out to tribal leaders and held discussions on issues facing the Indian country. And as a result of that, we had this consultation policy. Prior to that, agencies kind of dealt with tribes on a piecemeal nature. And so this is an effort by the administration to try to create an administrative-wide policy that promoted tribal consultation. You'll note that, Department of Interior had their departmental manual 512 DM2, and that dealt mainly at that time with identification, conservation, and protection of trust resources. And it did include consultation anytime that the department was thinking about things that happened with respect to trust resources. They had to reach out to tribes and consult with them and share their information on possible impact with trust resources. Fast forward to 2000 and Executive Order 13175. The one thing that you see on your screen right now is the purpose. We wanted to talk about the purpose of the executive order because it's important to understand, what the provision encompasses, right? So under the executive order, its purpose is in order to establish regular and meaningful consultation and collaboration with tribal officials. And that meaningful right there on your screen is something that a lot of tribes go back and forth with federal agencies on what constitutes meaningful consultation. And you'll note, from the discussion further on that we have a lot of ideas with respect to that. So meaningful consultation in the development of federal policies that have tribal implications to strengthen the United States government's government relationships with Indian tribes and to reduce the imposition of unfunded mandates upon Indian tribes. So you'll note that it deals with policies that have tribal implications. And if you go to the next slide, please, Darren, that tribal implications is broad in scope. So before, as I noted, 512 DM2, which is kind of similar to this provision, dealt strictly with identification, conservation, and protection of trust resources. Executive Order 13175, which is agency-wide, applies much broader in scope. So that definition of what is tribal implications refers to regulations, legislative comments, or proposed legislation, and other policy statements or actions that have substantial direct effects on one or more Indian tribes, on the relationship between the federal government and Indian tribes, or on the distribution of power and responsibilities between the federal government and Indian tribes. And next slide, please. We'll see that basically the intent of Executive Order 13175 was to acknowledge the political status between tribal nations, the rights to tribal self-governments, and to honor the treaty and other rights held by Indian tribes with respect to the United States. In consultation, the consultation provision basically provided that each agency had to have an accountable process to ensure meaningful and timely input from tribal officials in the development of regulatory policies. Next slide, please. But importantly, to note, they did have this provision under Section 10. And Section 10 of the executive order basically states, this order is intended only to improve the internal management of the executive branch, and is not intended to create any right, benefit, or trust responsibility, substantive or procedural, enforceable at law by a party against the United States, its agencies, or any person. So you have a standard kind of catch-all savings clause by the federal government that basically says this doesn't create a right of action. So, some people have noted that this means that the Executive Order 13175 doesn't really have teeth and it doesn't need to be enforced. But I think, this is, from my perspective, it seems like just one of those things that federal agencies do to try to be able to provide a policy that's strong and works on behalf of tribes, but at the same time to be able to protect, the trust or the federal fisc, so to speak, from suit, right? So we'll note that, the Executive Order 13175 is something that NCAI and other tribes have used very effectively in a number of instances. And a lot of it has to do with, tribes, holding the federal government accountable for actions that they're taking. So for instance, if tribes see a regulation in the Federal Register and they know that they haven't been consulted on it, one of the things that tribes will do is they'll reach out to the agency that's proposing that regulation with a strong letter, basically saying that under Executive Order 13175, that the agency has a duty to consult with tribes. And even though EO 13175 is broad in nature, you'll also note that a lot of agencies have individualized consultation policies. In fact, this executive order mandates that agencies develop policies. And so Fish and Wildlife, for instance, might have, their own tribal consultation policy that's consistent with Executive Order 13175. So when, Fish and Wildlife in this scenario would be putting forth a regulation that might have broad effects on Indian country, but they failed to consult, then tribes, would write letters to Fish and Wildlife citing the Fish and Wildlife consultation policy, as well as the broader EO 13175, and asking for consultation. And this has been effective policy throughout the time that Executive Order 13175 has been in existence. And I'll note that, and we'll get into this a little bit further as Jody starts discussing the GAO report, is that something that tribes have known all along, is that some agencies do consultation better and some agencies need improvement. And so with that, we'll go ahead and kick it over to Jody, and he'll discuss a little bit about the genesis of the GAO report and its findings, and we'll continue the discussion. So thank you for your time, everyone.
All right, so let's jump into the report itself. And let me just say right at the outset that if you haven't had a chance to pull the report and read through it, I highly recommend that you do so. If these issues are of any interest to you and/or the tribal community that you're from or working with, I think it's worth your time. It's a pretty meaty report. It exceeds 100 pages. The GAO's discussion itself is maybe 55, 60 pages, if I'm recalling correctly. But there's also several appendices to the report, I think at least a couple of which include specific responses and inputs from the various agencies that GAO talked to when it conducted the report. So maybe Derek and Darren can provide a link to the report to folks who are on the webinar here today, or wherever we're going to end up posting this material after it's over, and you can easily access the report there if you haven't gotten it already. This report appears to be about a couple of years in the making if you look and read into some of the details of what GAO wrote. But it was a response, obviously, to members of Congress, both a couple of senators, but largely members of the House, most of which are very familiar to Indian country. If you look at the list of congressional requesters for the report, asking GAO to look at federal agency processes for consulting with tribes, specifically on infrastructure projects. And so they're looking at the extent to which agencies have policies for consulting with tribes and Alaska Native corporations, factors that hinder effective consultation on those projects, and then what are the steps that agencies have taken to facilitate tribal consultation on these projects. And they specifically talked to 21 agencies, and I'll just run through them really quickly just so folks know who we're talking about. 3 what we call independent regulatory agencies, the FCC, FERC, and the NRC. 3 departments, or I guess cabinet level agencies, the Department of Energy, EPA and HUD, and then 15 what we'll call component agencies of larger departments. So from USDA, you have the Forest Service and Rural Development. From the Department of Commerce, you have NOAA. You have the Army Corps of Engineers. From Homeland Security, Coast Guard, and FEMA. From the Department of the Interior, BLM, BOEM, the Bureau of Reclamation, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service. And then from DOT, you've got the FAA, the Federal Highway Administration, the Federal Railroad Administration, and the Federal Transit Administration. And then all of these agencies, or the departments that they're part of, are all members of this Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council, which was established in 2015 during the Obama years, a body that was really intended to try to make infrastructure permitting more efficient. And so that's the perspective that GAO is coming from in examining these issues. So let's go to the next slide. So I want to talk just for a second about what they used to examine tribal consultation. They took comments that tribes made during around the 2016 consultations that came in the wake of the Dakota Access protest and the administration's reconsideration of the permitting that was going on with respect to the Dakota Access Pipeline. And so there were a round of consultations that ultimately resulted in a report just at the end of the Obama administration about improving tribal consultation. GAO also undertook itself a series of interviews with tribes, as well as the representatives from the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. They also talked to a number of intertribal organizations, including NCAI, USET, a handful of others well-known around the country, just to try to get good perspective from Indian country. So we're talking about, with respect to the 2016 consultations, I think there were at least 100 tribes that provided comments there, another 50 tribes who provided input, and then certainly interviews with the agencies that I just rattled off in the last slide, those 21, to get a fairly good sampling of what views are on tribal consultation. All right, so what the report does and was the first kind of outline, what are the bases for tribal consultation that we're going to operate by here. And so there are really 3 key sources in federal law for tribal consultation. Derek talked about one, EO 13175, and that's all the way at the bottom, and we'll get to that in a second. But they also talk a little bit about the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106 of that act, which requires tribal consultation for any agency undertaking that can affect historic properties. The report also cites NEPA and the Council on Environmental Quality regulations that require agencies to consult with tribes early when evaluating impacts of proposed projects. And if you look at, there's no real specifics around what the consultation requirements are there. And, you know, who knows exactly what CEQ's thinking was, you know, with respect to, you know, why it addressed consultation in the way it did. But, you know, really the details of requirements, at least with respect to permitting and compliance with federal law as it relates to tribal consultation, is more to be found in Section 106 itself and its implementing regulations, which were promulgated by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And you'll find those ACHP regulations if anybody wants to look in their CFR for those at 36 CFR Part 800. Then the one other source Derek mentioned is Executive Order 13175. A couple of other things I just want to point out with respect to that order, in addition to what he's already talked about, is one, that Congress went itself in 2004 to enact federal law that said that agencies must consult with Alaska Native corporations on the same basis as they do with tribes under Executive Order 13175. So they took the step of requiring that in federal law. And then just at the beginning of the Obama administration, a memorandum on tribal consultation was issued that asked agencies to take another hard look at their consultation policies. And so in my view, in some ways kind of re-upped the obligations of EO 13175 that was issued by President Clinton. So again, just emphasizing these sources of the consultation requirements that agencies have. So let's go on to the next slide. Back when I want everybody to just see this graph right here. So this was one of the interesting images from the report, talking specifically about Alaska Native Corporation consultation. You can see here that the majority of the agencies that GAO talked to are not actually in compliance with federal law with respect to consultation with Alaska Native corporations. Only 9 of the 21 agencies that they talked to actually address how agencies should consult, how their specific agencies ought to consult with Alaska Native corporations. You had 3, the Army Corps, the FAA, and FEMA, who said, okay, you know, we haven't addressed this, but we're going to deal with it in 2019. You've got 2, the Coast Guard and the Fish and Wildlife Service, who said, oh, you know, we need to address this, but we really don't have a good time frame for doing that. You've got 3 more, Energy, HUD, and EPA, who just don't address it at all. And we'll get to the next slide just to reference why they said they didn't. And you can go ahead and flip over. But EPA, Energy, and HUD have kind of taken the position, well, I don't know, you know, we really don't need to deal with this because they're not federally recognized tribes. We don't have a government-to-government relationship with them. You know, it's really not relevant because they're not recipients or grantees of our agency program. So it's, it's kind of not of a big deal to us. The issue just kind of jumped out to me simply because we're talking about a requirement in federal law that these agencies had decided they don't want to comply with. Certainly could understand them taking the position, and I do agree with the view that Native corporations are not tribes. There's no question about that, just as a matter of law. But the fact that these agencies have decided, we really don't need to address this, is just kind of an interesting perspective. There were 3 others: FCC, FERC, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, who are independent agencies. And so if you look at 13175, what the order says with respect to agencies like that, the order encourages them to comply with the tribal consultation requirements that are set out in the order, but they don't have the same obligation to do so as agencies who are not independent regulatory agencies would have. All right, so let's go. All right, so just going to run through some of the findings of GAO here with respect to what tribes have said about factors that hinder effective consultation. And I'm guessing that pretty much everybody on the webinar here has kind of heard these things in one form or another. So I don't think this is going to be any news to anyone. It certainly wasn't to me. But from the materials that GAO pulled and from the interviews that they did, they said there are problems with initiating consultation. Agencies wait too late to talk to us about it. The scope of who we need to talk to or the tribes that might be impacted, it's too small because they're not pulling in tribes, although those tribes may not be in the area where a particular project is ongoing. There may be a tribe who has treaty rights there. They may have ancestral lands and a significant connection to those areas, even though the tribe may not be headquartered or have ongoing activity in those areas, and agencies are not pulling in those tribes. Tribes have said, the agency experts who are looking at these issues don't completely understand the issues. They don't understand the full extent of the tribal resources that are being impacted by the project. And we're not finding out about these consultation invitations. A letter may get sent to whoever at the tribe. It's not directed to the people that the letter needs to be directed to. Tribes also raise concerns about engagement with agencies and how agencies use tribal inputs. And this really goes to, I think, when Derek raised the issue of meaningful consultation as it's set out in EO 13175, and that requirement, which can on one hand be vague, and you can argue about what that really means. Tribes saying, look, we're not having meaningful consultation as is required by law because our comments are not adequately considered. You're not, we may get to tell you about our problems with a particular project, or we think things ought to be done a certain way, but we're not hearing back from you. There needs to be a two-way dialogue. We need to understand why you're making the decision that you're making, and show us how you've used the input that we provided. Also, you're looking at kind of the scope of the project, the things that you're asking us about, whether it's the geographic impacts of the project, how long those impacts are going to last, other impacts of the project that we are sharing with you. You're not taking into account the full scope of information that we're providing to you, and it needs to be broader than what it is. So no big news there about some of the things tribes are saying. A few more on the next slide. So tribes are also saying, hey, agencies, you're not respecting these long-standing principles of federal Indian law, like tribal sovereignty, like fulfilling your trust responsibility to us, honoring our treaty rights. Those things aren't taken into account when you're making these infrastructure permitting decisions. Tribes also raise concerns about limited resources that keep them from fully participating in consultation, whether that's the kind of expertise that's needed to review surveys and reports, or having enough money to visit sites, or provide folks who can help and provide input during a consultation, funding for tribal historic preservation officers, and then just the avalanche of requests for input that tribes will get, and being able to provide that information back to agencies in a timely fashion can often be a problem. And so we as tribal entities sometimes do not have the full resources that we need to adequately respond. And then tribes also talked about limited agency knowledge and training in these areas, whether it's about tribal, cultural, and history. agency personnel not really understanding consultation requirements and really understanding federal Indian law. I think that in of itself, those points kind of lead to some of the comments earlier on that page, and then even on the previous slide where tribes are pointing out that maybe, you know, if we started with agencies really knowing what they were doing, having a better understanding of Indian country, having a better understanding of their legal requirements and an understanding of tribes, we might be able to get to the bottom of some of these other concerns that we have. So those were concerns raised by tribes. The next couple of slides talk about the agency perspective on this. And I would say for me personally, this was one of the more interesting parts of reading this report. Maybe in large part because I kind of understood this, or maybe if I don't completely understand, at least had talked with tribes enough and heard from tribes enough to have a grasp of the kinds of concerns that they raised, but not really fully appreciating things that agencies themselves might be saying about, these are the reasons why we think that there are problems with our tribal consultation processes and a disconnect between us and tribal entities when we're trying to do consultation and comply with law. And so it was interesting to me from that perspective. And so here are a few things that they talked about. One, initiating consultation. So agencies are saying, we have some difficulty in figuring out who exactly it is we need to consult with. In addition to a tribe that may be located in close proximity to the project that we're looking at permitting, who else has treaty rights in this area? Whose ancestral lands might be on, even if that tribe is no longer to this whole government, for tribes and tribal leaders, and part of directing consultation invitations to tribes, not knowing sometimes, is this going to the right person? Do I have good contact information? And that being an area of disconnect, just finding out who is this supposed to go to. So it's not really dissimilar from some of the concerns that we hear tribes raise, just kind of the other side of the coin, at least on that point. They talked about tribal participation in consultation, saying that tribal participation can be low, that they don't get responses from tribes despite multiple attempts to contact them. Sometimes tribes can be reluctant to respond for various reasons, and and a lot of other things that tribes may need to prioritize over attending a consultation meeting, other issues, high priorities that they're dealing with in their communities. And a particular consultation and being able to attend when an agency says, can you meet us, is just not at the top of the list. So a handful of things there. Let's go on to another slide. They also kind of look inward with respect to some problems that they were having. Their capacity to conduct consultation, what resources they have to support consultation activities, whether that's not having enough bodies and not having enough money to do what they need to do. The fact that consultation can be expensive, and not only for them, but also for tribes who they need to consult with under law, trying to meet just the fiscal needs of dealing with holding consultations and making sure you've got proper folks there from tribes to adequately represent the concerns that need to be raised as part of any consultation. Their own workloads inside the agencies. So that, so just as part of any consultation, the high number of consultations they might be having to deal with, consultations lasting a long time, the fact that with any particular project, you may have a number of tribes who need to be consulted and want to be consulted on a possible permit decision figuring out who those tribes are, making sure they're consulting with them as required by law, and then also saying, hey, we've got folks that may not know enough about what they need to know, and they need to be trained, and they need to understand what the law is, and the tribes that they're dealing with, their cultures and their histories. Also cited was problems with interagency coordination. It's often the case that when more than one federal agency who's involved in that project, it could involve Interior, EPA, Justice. For any one particular project, you could have multiple agencies interacting and needing to sign off before a particular approval is given that a project proponent is looking for. And so the report notes that one of the problems is just the fact that the interaction of those agencies in trying to make sure they are upholding their consultation obligation is dealing with varying consultation practices inside those agencies, trying to marry those, as well as what kind of priority each of those agencies brings to tribal consultation, because each of their cultures with respect to consultation can be different. And so dealing with all of those, meshing them together in a way where you kind of get a unified effort to approach tribal consultation in the way that it ought to be as required by law can be a challenge. So GAO ultimately gets to a series of recommendations towards the end of its report. And if you don't get a chance to get through anything else in this report, I highly recommend that you skip to the end just so you can see what GAO, in a little more detail than what we're talking about here, is suggesting. So one of the things they do is consider whether there ought to be some kind of central federal information system that identifies tribal contacts and areas of significance to tribes, so that there's a better sense and a uniform sense, if you will, across the federal government, so that all agencies know that when there's an infrastructure project that's up for permitting and areas of impact need to be considered, one central database for that. And this recommendation really comes out of a 2018 best practices report that the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council put out, and where they were actually considering whether a system that HUD has put into place, I'm trying to find the name of it here, but if folks want to look it up, HUD's Tribal Directory Assessment Tool, which is a system that HUD has put together for tribal contacts and areas of interest to tribes, and saying, can we scale this up to a government-wide level? And so that's an idea that GAO explores as action that agencies may want to take going forward. They also talk about similar systems that the Forest Service has a tribal connections mapping system, and then I'm guessing a number of folks on the phone are probably familiar with that, and one that I think lots of people here from time to time cited as kind of a good example of one of these kinds of systems is the FCC's Tower Construction Notification System. And so, again, the idea is, can we scale one of these up so that everybody is kind of on the same page with respect to who are the folks in Indian country and in different tribal governments that we need to deal with, and what are the areas of significance that we need to make sure that we're consulting with tribes about that particular area when we're looking at the impacts of a project. One of the issues that GAO kind of wrestles with a bit in this report and talks about the steering committee's review of it is, okay, this is a good idea potentially, but where do we get the resources to do this? So HUD obviously can't take this on themselves. So if we wanted to scale this up federal government wide, we need some resources in order to do that. So second thing they say is, all right, agencies need to take another look at ensuring that they are engaged in meaningful two-way consultation, and document in your tribal consultation policies how tribal input is considered and how you're going to communicate with tribes about that. So one thing they pointed out in reviewing the various consultation policies that they looked at was that I think 16 or 17 of the 21 agencies that they talked to say, they say, hey, meaningful consultation includes two-way discussions. It's not just about tribes talking to us, but we want to actually engage with them. There needs to be conversation between us. But GAO also points out that despite that fact, only 5 of those 21 agencies actually say in their policies, all right, we are going to give tribes feedback. We're actually going to talk to them and tell them how their input is considered, so that, I guess, even in a situation where maybe you don't land on the same page with a tribe about a decision, at least the tribe understands, here's how your input was taken into account in our decision making. Here's our rationale for dealing with that. And so GAO is saying, at the very least, what you ought to do is document in your policies how tribal input is considered. That's really really important. The third bullet down there is probably familiar to anybody who has talked about, thought about, read about tribal consultation in the last handful of years. Appendix C of the Army Corps of Engineers 33 CFR Part 325, which is the Army Corps of Engineers' effort to implement the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106, tribal consultation requirements. Folks know that policy is really in tension with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation's Section 106 tribal consultation requirements. There's a real tension between the two, and everyone knows that the Army Corps policies and approach towards tribal consultation is far more lax than the requirements that are set forth in the ACHP's requirements. And so GAO reminds us that this battle rages on between Army Corps and ACHP and folks who believe that the Army Corps policies need to come up to standard as required by federal law. Interestingly enough, following all the consultations that happened post-DAPL, the post-DAPL protest in 2016, the Army Corps, Interior, and the Department of Justice issued a report in which the Army Corps said, hey, we're going to make a commitment to reviewing our Appendix C and bringing it into line with what's required by law. We need to revise this, and that was pretty clear. The only problem with that is that was occurring, at the time of the exit of the Obama administration. In October of 2017, in response to executive order, I think it's 13783 from President Trump, which required federal agencies to take a look at their regulatory policies that might make energy development less efficient than the administration thought it ought to be. The Army Corps of Engineers says, hey, our Appendix C is just fine. So we don't think that there's a problem with it. So GAO says, you know what, this is an issue that's been ongoing for several decades now. We think at the very least, Congress ought to take a look and consider, whether we ought to amend the law to make clear about what the Army Corps needs to do, or whether that's to bring their policy in line with NHPA Section 106, or make clear what the Army Corps is doing is just fine, but somehow legislatively clarify what the Army Corps ought to be doing so that you kind of resolve this question once and for all. Alternatively, I guess the Army Corps could update its policy consistent with calls for that from Indian country and elsewhere, but at least for the time being, it doesn't look like the agency needs to do it plans to do that at all. And then finally, the very first thing we talked about, kind of the first thing that GAO jumped on, they recommend that all these agencies who have not referenced Alaska Native corporations and consulting with them as required by federal law enacted in 2004 ought to do that. And so they don't, what GAO doesn't say is you got to regard them as federally recognized tribes. But I think their point is, look, you know, you ought to come into compliance with the law. This is what Congress said in 2004, that EO 13175 needed to be extended to Alaska Native corporations, and your consultation policies don't indicate that you are consulting with those Native corporations as the law requires. So those are kind of the key takeaways, in my view, from the report on GAO's recommendations. So next slide here, and last slide from me. Next steps for tribal governments. So I think these are some things to think about. Maybe some discussion points here. You know, after we're done talking, folks want to ask questions, or maybe it's stuff to just take back and talk about internally with the tribal governments that you're representing or organizations you are representing. One, is there an opportunity for advocacy on the Army Corps' Section 106 procedures, on Appendix C, you know, kind of using the backing of what GAO has said about the ongoing dispute about whether those procedures are adequate. Other advocacy to modify agency consultation policies, just kind of using, you know, what GAO has said is that, you know, here are the shortfalls, or here are the discrepancies, here are the inconsistencies across agencies. You know, would tribes be interested in going to one particular or a couple of agencies and saying, you know, we really think you ought to modify your policies in a certain way to deal with, you know, particular issues that tribal governments have arising out of consultation, and where that's not adequate. Another thing that tribes might consider being proactive about is actually taking a look at, and regularly taking a look, if you're not doing that already, and I assume the bulk of Indian country is, but if you're not, it's probably a good practice just to make sure that agencies have the latest and greatest from you on who your tribal leaders are, who are the folks that ought to be contacted about tribal consultation. So I think, you know, that would help to just eliminate some confusion, a very simple step, to the extent you're concerned that invitations to consult are not getting to the right people, you know, making sure that agencies have good information from you about that. The recommendation that GAO raised again on the steering committee's the steering committee's recommendation, whether there ought to be a central information system, and if you like that idea, you know, what can be done to really advocate for that, for finding additional resources for that? What are the sources of information that we use? Does it make sense to scale up what HUD has provided, as you know, talked about in that report? Are there other examples that can be looked at? One of the things that GAO cites, it actually talks about a model consultation system that was put out by the Salt River community in Arizona as a really good example of a consultation database that might be used. And I haven't looked at it myself, but I would encourage you to try to take a look at that if that's an issue or an issue of interest to you. Take a look at the system that's being used in Arizona based on what Salt River has done, and whether something like that could be a model to have a federal government-wide system that with just a place where information can be done, contact information, what are the areas of significance to our tribal community. Identifying opportunities for agency staff training. And so here's an issue as to whether tribal governments want to look at, the agencies that we're interacting with. Are there opportunities to talk with them more, to share more with them, so that they understand who we are and what's important to us, what our priorities are, to the extent that's not happening already, just so that when these permitting issues come up, agencies have a much better perspective about where you're coming from and concerns that you're raising, as opposed to approaching permitting decisions more ignorantly than they necessarily would have to if there are training opportunities in place. That could potentially be an opportunity to build relationships as well with agency staffs from the federal agencies that you're dealing with. And then lastly, maybe goes without being said, but also whether using a report like this and some of the problems that GAO identified, it just provides another tool to tribal governments to go back to agencies and say, look, these are still issues that we're dealing with, and you need to deal with them, agencies, so that they're understanding their consultation duties and they're understanding their obligations under law, honoring treaty rights, and dealing with the federal trust responsibility as they're required to do. And so using this report and some of the concerns that it raises as a tool in that way. So just some ideas there for, and there are countless others I'm sure that folks can come up with for ways to use the report for Indian country's benefit, but just a couple of ideas that might spark some additional thoughts, discussion, and hopefully action. So thanks.
So I think now we've got some time for questions, comments, if folks want to pose any questions. If not, certainly got one or two for Jody and Derek. I don't see anybody's raise their hand immediately. So the one question to start off that I had for both Jody and Derek was, this is a very general one, and Jody, you sort of touched on it earlier. That was, if you had one takeaway, folks, to read the recommendation section, yeah. Or one piece of advice. Are there 1, 2, 3 big pieces or takeaways from the report that you suggest?
So I think in terms of action items, yeah. I think this notion that of exploring like a central information system that everybody is looking to might be a good idea. I mean, the fact that you've got FIFC on board with this, you've got GAO citing it, seems like it could have some momentum behind it if that's something that's attractive to tribes, and could be a way of just kind of dealing with easy stuff, like when you're talking about permitting and agency review of issues like that's fraught with all sorts of perils and problems and issues to debate. But it seems to me like one of the easy things to do is to say, these are the people that you need to talk to in our tribal community, and to the extent a tribe is willing to do it, these are the areas that we really care about, yeah. Right? And so like baseline stuff like that, in my mind at least, is could be really helpful in just getting over like some of the more simple stuff, and so that you can get into the meat of challenges to deal with these types of projects.
Sure.
I would just add to that just more on a broad scope. I think, as you noted earlier, Jody, the GAO report didn't really say anything that tribes haven't already been saying for a while. NCAI submitted comments in November 2016 that were on the tribal trust compliance and federal infrastructure decision making. And we commented on a lot of the things that were in this report, specifically the need to amend Appendix C. Within the last year, CEQ also put out a notice and comment for proposed changes to their NEPA regulations. We responded to those with some of the same suggestions here, that the scope is just not broad enough when the federal government's looking at consulting with tribes. And oftentimes it's just confined within the exterior boundaries of a reservation, but they're not taking into consideration the historic land loss and how a lot of federal lands outside of Indian reservations were all traditional and ancestral lands of tribes. And so there's a lot of historic and cultural significance in those lands, and that tribes, deserve an opportunity to be consulted on projects around and surrounding those lands. And one of the things we've been thinking about, in general is, if it involves trust resources, then the Department of Interior should be playing some kind of an anchor role in consultation. You noted in your presentation earlier kind of the need for interagency coordination. DOI should be playing a leadership role in some respects in those instances. But I guess the takeaway from me is that here you have a GAO report coming from an independent federal agency that basically confirms a lot of the things that tribes has been saying about the consultation process. And that would be helpful, in advocacy when it comes to Appendix C and otherwise. And I also wanted to talk about, also wanted Darren to maybe mention a little bit about, his ideas, if he had any, on the central information system with civic and tribal nations and member agencies.
Yeah, thank you, Derek. From my end, and the way I've been thinking about this, and this is sort of in the context of a project that NCAI has been working on, which is trying to develop and working on developing a handbook actually for energy proponents when they're working, and this is to Derek's point, and doing projects that are off reservation that are still going to impact tribal resources in one way or another. And so trying to raise the issue for energy proponents about how they might interact with tribes. And one of the things that we were thinking about early on was exactly this sort of large national GIS-based database that would be an identifier for proponents and here for federal agencies to figure out, or to at least have a sense of who they should contact. And one of the ideas that I had, and this is something that the HUD map brings up, even with its limitations, the HUD GIS map shows is, it's a GIS-based map that's county by county. You can click on the county, and then what comes up is contact information for a particular tribe. That's fantastic. There's certainly limitations to that. Like how do you maintain and keep the data updated and those sorts of things. And that's a question to build out. But it's certainly something that I think is, in reading the report is a very good, solid foundation to build off of. But it also raises the question that'll sort of highlight here and pose to Derek and Jody is, this tension, right? Because in the consultation policies, it's a federal agency that has to identify the tribal resource.
Yeah.
Yet that seems to set up a tension.
Right.
Because who's best at identifying the tribal resource but the tribes? And I'm thinking of even Representative Grijalva's draft, discussion draft of the Respect Act, and the draft that he introduced last session had this process, and it creates that tension, right? And it seems like this national system that FIPSIC is sort of suggesting is maybe a way around it, where tribes can populate and show that interest and indicate that interest, and then it allows the federal government to go back.
Right. Yeah. I agree.
Okay.
I kind of think that kind of invokes the grandma code, right? If you're not doing it right, your grandma's gonna come in to show you how to do it right. So tribal nations can step into those shoes. And I think one of the other tensions, based on what you were saying, Darren, that raises is this idea that sometimes tribes don't want to identify areas of cultural significance or historic significance. And so the way that we've kind of approached that is that tribes could just say, hey, these areas right here are significant to us. We're not going to say why, or, but we want to be consulted anytime you're doing anything in this area. And so it could be, there has to be ways to kind of protect, the privacy of tribes as well, but also have them play a meaningful role in identifying those areas. That's a good point.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, so it looks like we've got a couple questions here. There's one question this asks is, does the report discuss or include any avenues or mechanisms for the inclusion of tribal law within the consultation process, including the tribe's own consultation processes and environmental and cultural resource standards?
Yeah. So from my review of the report, I did not see a lot of discussion about that. If I'm recalling correctly, maybe there was some reference in the report, when we're talking about with respect to training initiatives and with respect to better understanding tribal cultures and tribal priorities. That concept of understanding tribal law, or having an appreciation for it, and its application within the tribal community itself. I think it may have been referenced, but not in that specific way. But I think that it raises a great point, right? Just about the fact that the folks that you're dealing with from agencies just have no clue, right? And I think that's actually a great place for education of agency staff about what tribal laws apply, or what tribal consultation policies tribes may have themselves, and what their priorities are for how those processes are work. Those are ways in which it's possible to find areas to refine existing federal agency consultation policies. That's a good idea.
Yeah, I agree. And I would just note that provision that Jody cited earlier, where they do discuss this mapping system that was developed by the Salt River Pima Indian Maricopa community. They discuss that briefly, but if you take a look at that website, it's really a lot of work done on behalf of the tribes. And I think that's a great point. And I think tribes definitely have their own internal inherent regulatory authority to be able to develop their own consultation processes. And I think that's a great idea. Great question.
Yeah, and then there's a second question here, and it asks, beyond the report's listed requesters, does the report provide, or does anybody here on the line, if congressional partners to take up these recommendations? Appendix C legislation, for example, I think that you were sort of referencing as a potential fix to the issues with Appendix C.
Yeah. So if you look at the list of requesters, Chairman Grijalva, his name is there, and and obviously, like, a number of these concepts are built into his draft Respect Act bill, and so that might be maybe beyond him, or a couple of other folks that have some weight that are among the requesters, like Senator Bernie Sanders, Senator Tom Udall. Possibly floating some kind of draft bill in connection with Chairman Grijalva and his staff, or the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs staff, might be a place to go with some kind of legislative advocacy. But I think the folks that are there are the Udalls of the world, or the Grijalvas of the world, and some of the other champions of Indian country issues in the Congress. I think kind of the obvious points of contact would be the places where I'd at least start with if I was going to undertake that.
I would say also that this is this was on the Army Corps' regulatory agenda up until last year, so it is something that they could do on their own. So there might be two-tiered approach where you work with members of Congress to maybe develop draft legislation, but you're also putting a little bit of pressure on Army Corps from the tribal to government perspective to amend Appendix C and make good on their previous, I guess, commitment to do so.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then, we're running a few minutes past the hour, but there was just one last question that I posed to both of you. And, thinking through the GAO report, there are resources that we didn't discuss today. Do you think that would be helpful for listeners to take a closer look at, whether it was a citation to a report or an example of a best practice. I mean, we raised the issue of Salt River, or are there other sources of principles, legal principles or ideas to look through as folks are trying to think through a response or, you know, a lens to read the GAO report through?
From my perspective, I think it doesn't hurt just to be reminded of what agencies were saying back at the beginning of 2017. So that January 2017 report that was put out by Interior, Army, Department of the Army, and Justice, and then there's a report that the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation followed up with a few months later are some helpful background and some helpful context, I think, for understanding how GAO approached this. Because that's my sense of what's referenced in the report, dates and whatnot. My sense is that GAO probably started their work around that time or shortly thereafter, and so it's kind of written in that context, if you will. And so that might be helpful in terms of just having a good handle on the universe of materials that's out there. The other thing I'd say is don't dismiss the appendices. I haven't had a chance to really dig into the appendices to this report myself, and like I said, they're about half, or maybe a little bit less than half of the 100 and whatever pages that are there. But I think that there's some good stuff, just kind of flipping through the appendices, some good stuff about individual agency perspectives, and so and comments from agencies on what GAO is doing, what it's saying here. So particularly for anybody who's kind of focused on one particular agency or another, kind of seeing what that particular agency may have said in response to what GAO's work here may be helpful, may give you some insight to the extent you're dealing with them or trying to advocate that particular agency does certain things with respect to tribal consultation policy.
Great.
And I would just add to Jody's list. I would just give another shameless plug of NCAI's comments on tribal trust compliance and federal infrastructure decision-making. Those were done in November 2016. And I think, at the end of this webinar, we're probably going to send a follow-up email once we upload it to YouTube. And in that, we'll probably include some materials, and I'll make sure we include those infrastructure decision-making comments and also, maybe a copy of the executive order, GAO report, and maybe 512 DM2 as well. But that's, that would be my recommendation.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. Well, we're about 10 minutes past the hour, and I know folks are busy and have to get on with their days as well. So I think we'll end it there. And thank everybody who hung on the line with us, and appreciate everybody who attended. As Derek noted, we'll send out a follow-up email, and just for those of you who are still on the line, a reminder that we will post a recording of this to our YouTube webpage, and that we will include a link, a direct link to that recording along with the slides in the follow-up email, along with PDF version of the slides, as well as the other resources that we've discussed. So with that, I'll end the webinar. And
I will say, I mean, if anybody has any particular questions, issues they want to discuss with respect to the report, my email was at the very beginning of the slideshow, and feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to chat with you about it, since we're not really in a format where we can talk after this. But if you have issues you want to raise, happy to communicate with you about it if you'd like to. So feel free.
Yeah, thank you. And just another thank you to Jody and Derek for joining us. Derek's remote, and Jody is joining us here at the Embassy of Tribal Nations. It was fantastic to have him. And with that, our emails are at the front of the slideshow. We'll look forward to hearing from you. If you've got other questions, we'll look forward to following up. And thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your days and your weekends, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.